Our moderator today is Thomas A. Kolditz, professor in the practice of leadership and management and director of Yale SOM's Leadership Development Program. Tom is a retired brigadier general who led the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point for 12 years. Now I'll turn things over to Tom, who will introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Ben. It's a great honor to be here, and we're all very grateful to these distinguished alumni for their willingness to come and share their ideas and thoughts with us here today. I'd like to introduce these individuals and give you a sense of who they are and what they bring to the panel. We first have Christine Bader, class of 2000, a visiting scholar and lecturer at Columbia University, a non-resident senior fellow with the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, and a human rights advisor to Business for Social Responsibility. She's working on her first book and previously worked for BP in Indonesia, China, and the UK, managing the social impacts of some of the company's largest projects in the developing world. We also have Don Gibbs, class of 1989, the former ambassador to South Africa, where he served in the position from October 1st, 2009 to January 4th, 2013. Before being asked to be President Obama's personal representative to South Africa, he was a leader on the presidential transition team and then served in the White House, where he ran the Office of Presidential Personnel, overseeing the selection of several thousand political appointments for the Obama administration. Nadeem Mata, class of 1989, is the president of Rapid Results Institute, which he founded in 2006, a nonprofit that builds capacity for accelerating implementation of social impact programs in developing countries. He is also a co-managing partner at Schaefer Consulting. Nadeem was selected as one of foreign policy's top global thinkers of 2012. And last, we have Leon Meng, class of 1997, who co-founded Ascendant Capital Partners in 2011 with fellow Yale School of Management alum Kevin Zhang, class of 94. Leon has been chief executive for Greater China with the hedge fund D.E. Shaw. Zhang was a Goldman Sachs partner and co-head of Goldman Sachs Asian Special Situations Group with responsibility for the firm's investing activity in China. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our panel, and I'd like to begin the discussion with a question. And the question is this. Many approaches to career planning and leader development focus on creating a plan. But when you talk to leaders, they usually say that their careers evolved organically rather than going according to plan. What are the foundational ideas that you hold on to as your roles and opportunities evolve circumstantially? And Christine, if you could honor us by kicking off the panel with your answer.
Sure, Tom, happy to. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us from around the world. Tom, I guess first of all, I want to appreciate the way that you phrased the question, which is talking about careers evolving organically rather than randomly, because one pet peeve that has come to really nag me is that when you hear people talk about their careers and they seem to depend on a certain amount of serendipity or randomness. They say, you know, I just got this call out of the blue one day. And you can't control the timing of these things, but it's really never random. People don't offer jobs to people out of the blue, to people who they've never heard of. They offer jobs to people who they know to be excellent through a friend or through a colleague. And so I suppose my philosophy and my approach all along has been to really put myself out there and talk to as many people as I can about what I'm interested in and what I want to do. Because again, you can't control the timing of these things, but you can create the space that allows them to happen. So that when an opening does come up, somebody will think to recommend me or to call me up. So I guess it's being genuine about what I'm interested in and trying to explore that with as many people as I can. And so the specific foundational idea for me has been that I came to SOM with a question. And that question was, can business be a force for good in the world? And, well, perhaps I should rephrase, not so much can business be, I know that it can be, but how do we make it so? And so I think that that's my foundational idea, and of course it's taken different iterations over the years, but that's the idea that's really driven me.
That's great. Don, how about you? Can you give us your perspective on that question?
Yeah, and wonderful to be on the call. Hello to everybody out there. I agree with Christine to a degree. I think, my career has definitely not gone according to any plan. It has been a little bit of serendipity here and there, but it has also been about reaching out to people, taking risks, sort of looking for new adventures. And the foundational ideas that I've tried to pursue as I've followed my career path are working on things I'm passionate about, whether those be in the public sector or the private sector, working with people I think I'll learn from and whose integrity and values I respect. And if I keep those two in mind, it's really helped guide my career, along with figuring out what the right balance in the jobs are between what I call the 4 F's: family, financial, fulfillment, and friends. And finding jobs that at different points in life balance those 4 F's has been sort of one of my key guiding posts as I've gone through my career.
Terrific. Nadim, how about your perspective on our first question?
Thanks, Tom, and hello to everybody out there. I very much am aligned with both Christine and Dawn in terms of the serendipity with which things seem to happen. I certainly did not have a plan, coming into the various career choices or options that I've faced. And probably the biggest sort of career decision where there was a lot of intentionality on my part was to really immerse myself in the work of the Rapid Results Institute, the NGO that my partners and I at Schaefer Consulting founded a number of years ago. And for me, this is sort of an ongoing choice that I make, which is, how much to immerse myself in that, as opposed to pursue other opportunities for more traditional consulting work. And two things that guide me in making that choice, both initially and along the way, that are foundational. One, very similar to what Don said, is what is the work that I am most passionate about doing? And the second is where can I create the most impact? I feel quite lucky and privileged to be able to guide my career choices by these two things. I know financial matters are really important, and financial pressures sometimes, veer us slightly away from these two things, but I've been lucky in that I've been able to stick with these two to guide me through.
Well, terrific. And then last but certainly not least, Leon, what's your perspective on that question? All right, maybe we've lost Leon. What I'd like to do next then is just follow up with a question on accountability, leader accountability. Recently, a number of CEOs have resigned their positions, citing accountability for the poor performance of their organizations. What does accountability mean for you in the context of everyday leadership? And as sort of a follow-on, what is your responsibility? How do you hold yourself accountable when something goes wrong on your watch? I'll just open that up to the panel for whoever'd like to contribute.
Can I volunteer, Dawn? No, sorry.
Nadim, are you saying I'm the one who's gotten into all sorts of accountability and poor management problems?
No, but you probably have concrete stories to tell on that. Living in Washington, as I do now, and watching
lots of these challenges go on around us. I think the one thing I took away, and actually took away mostly from my time in the private sector, is when there are issues with poor performance, own up to them. Whether you're leading the organization, whether you're responsible for the problem, too often the biggest challenges are when people try to brush things under the rug or hide the facts instead of being forthcoming, putting the facts out there, digging into what actually caused it, understanding if the performance problem is a systemic problem or is a one-time problem, and then getting in front of the problem instead of waiting and hiding behind it. And the only other thing that I've tried to do is to lead and not blame. So if you're running an organization, something happens underneath you, even if you didn't know about it, you're still responsible for it. Whether that means, as some have done recently in Washington, you have to step down, or if it's a different scale, but taking ownership for the problem, still taking action if people, certainly if they behave without integrity or if there are continual performance problems, being honest and straightforward and moving those people onward. But, I have found in my career path, that the more straightforward and honest you can be, the better off everyone is, including even the people who have the performance issues.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that, Don. I think for me, this is the question that I'm struggling with right now. And Tom, as you mentioned, I'm working on my first book right now, and it's in part based on my time with BP. I joined BP right after SOM and spent 9 years with the company and developed a niche managing the human rights impacts of some of the company's biggest projects, mostly in the developing world, and becoming an expert in whatever you want to call it. Now people call it corporate social responsibility or sustainability. And I feel really proud about the work that I did, but obviously BP is known for some pretty horrific things having gone wrong. And so the book in part is to explore that. What does it mean to do this work in a company when things can go terribly wrong? And I think that the truth lies somewhere in between my beating myself up for, what more could I have done? How much harder could I have worked? Not that I was responsible for offshore rigs, and maybe I couldn't have done anything to help prevent the Deepwater Horizon explosion, but I was part of this company. And I think at the opposite end of the spectrum, many of you might have read Why I Left Goldman Sachs by Greg Smith, based on his op-ed that got a lot of press. And he was on the opposite end of saying, gosh, this place is so corrupt. And it was the company that he was part of for 10 years. And so I thought that was really infuriating and naughty and irresponsible. And sure, he wasn't running the company, but I don't think any of us can absolve ourselves from responsibility for the cultures that we're part of. So again, I think the truth lies somewhere in between looking around and going, gosh, these people are horrible, and my beating myself up over what role I might have played. So I think that it is one thing when you're leading an organization, and I think you are responsible for what occurs within it. But if you're not in a position of very senior management, what is that role? And to me, that's an open question.
Tom, this is
great
Leon.
Answer.
On this question, I think taking responsibility is, the minimum that any leader or anyone who wants to be a leader has to have the kind of quality. Accountability is everything, and something goes wrong on your watch, go fix it. That has always been my fundamental belief. I would like to go back to the first question, which I didn't, due to technical glitches, I did not answer properly. On the first question you had asked in terms of career planning, when I went to the United States for college education.
Oh, I think perhaps we lost Leon again, and he'll be back shortly. But in the meantime, I'd like to ask another question that has to do with the relationship of results to ethics. And it's the perception of many that in many organizations that good results tend to trump leadership and ethics, that what people are rewarded for is performance, and that includes rewards from stockholders and rewards from their supervisors, and that good leadership and good ethics are second to that. Have you seen ways in which the ethical behavior in organizations has demonstrably improved performance rather than competing with it?
Well, sure. I mean, I think this, this is what my whole field is about. That my first job out of SOM was working for BP in Indonesia, and I was working on a liquefied natural gas plant that the company was building in West Papua at the eastern tip of Indonesia, which is an incredibly remote and sensitive place. And the whole idea there behind my work is that we were doing, again, it didn't have this label at the time, but corporate responsibility, which was not philanthropy. It was not an add-on. It was not this sort of carbon offset model where you do terrible things and then build a library. It was where we were trying to figure out how the company's interest could be best aligned with the community's interest, because there are all sorts of terrible examples around the world where companies were not paying attention to the needs of surrounding communities and not behaving ethically, and the community could shut down a project, whether it's by blocking the only access road, or sabotaging company equipment, or kidnapping staff. So my work was all about aligning the interests of the company and the community, and demonstrating that if we behave in a manner that is ethical and is holistic and is all of the things that SOM stands for, that would absolutely contribute to the company's stability and success.
Tom, I want to take a slightly different twist on this question, and start by slightly disagreeing with the framing of it. It's sort of as if you're saying we're placing results on sort of one hand of the scale, performance and results, and on the other hand, leadership and ethics. And my experience and my belief really through the work that I've been doing is that leadership is about enabling organizations and communities to actually deliver meaningful results. I mean, that's the primary purpose of leadership, but to do it in a responsible and ethical manner. So for me, leadership without results is not that meaningful. And a bit of an aside on this is that we've done a lot of work with government leaders in Africa as part of the Rapid Results Institute's work. And you hear a lot about government leaders in Africa having a bad reputation, on the scale of corruption and other issues. Now, my observation, and Don, I'd be interested in your perspective on this from the vintage of South Africa, is that most government leaders actually come into government with the best of intentions. And what I've observed is that when they try hard to deliver results and impact and fail repeatedly, they may begin to get tempted by corruption. And in fact, one of the best things that we can do to fight corruption in developing countries is to help particularly government leaders deliver better results. I think it works much better to help people deliver good results than to preach about ethics. So in a sense, in the context of development work that I've seen, developing country work, the experience that I've had is that high performance actually reinforces ethical behavior. So of course it's not sufficient, but it's certainly a great influence on it. So I slightly kind of would turn the question on its head, and I hope I haven't avoided answering the question, but I thought it's a slightly different way to think about it.
Tom, if I can just add one piece to that. I think some of this, having lived through the internet boom in my private sector life, I saw a lot of people get rich very fast by doing some things that weren't necessarily above board and didn't sort of hold to the highest ethical standards. I also saw people go to jail for it. And I think part of this is, coming back to the core of your question, there's short-termism where people can actually do quite well by avoiding ethics, but that catches up with most people over the long term. And I think that's true in organizations, in the private sector, in government. I think long-run value is created by being a responsible, ethical citizen. And I think if you look at organizations that have survived the test of time, politicians that have survived the test of time, it's those ethics and that moral responsibility, whether it's a Warren Buffett in the private sector or any number of public sector leaders. Without that ethical base, it's a short-term phenomenon. It's the long-term winners are those who stick to their ethics and have that solid core of integrity.
Great perspective. Okay, we've got some questions now that have come in from our listeners, and I'd like to ask the first one, and it's very much a personal question for you all. When did you first feel you were a leader, and did that depend on some level of career success?
I was 22 in Sri Lanka. Through a set of circumstances, was thrown into running a refugee camp after the Sinhalese and Tamil Civil War first broke out. And I had no background or no capability to be a leader. I just was in the right place at the right time and was asked to take it on, and there wasn't a lot to even think about. It was just sort of circumstances put me there.
Yeah, I mean, sort of very similar situation that I found myself in. Perhaps the most poignant moment of feeling like I need to be a leader and therefore I'm just gonna act the part and see where we come out is in fact when I was at SOM, I took a year off and went back to Lebanon and volunteered for Save the Children to set up a food assistance program for them during the Civil War. The moment that the tipping moment for me actually was a particularly challenging situation where we were expecting a food shipment to come into Lebanon to then repackage and begin distributing, and we were essentially told 2 days before the shipment arrived that the plans that we had laid out to receive this and to deal with it and warehouse it basically have gone out the door all of a sudden because the shipping agent wanted to get the ship in and out in 1 day to avoid demurrage and insurance charges, and basically dump the whole batch of food in the port of Beirut, which was non-functional as a storage place, etc. And it was sort of a moment of choice here, if you give up or you try and work with what you have. And I was able to mobilize my team to respond to the situation and actually practically brought the port of Beirut back to life in time to begin storing the food and then getting a process to distribute it. And of course, from that point on, I felt like the challenge that enabled me to respond in this way sort of stayed with me as, everything can be doable, and I think it's been at the core of the work that I've been doing, particularly in the developing country context with the Rapid Results Institute. But that was a defining moment for me.
Oh, that's great. Can I, Christine, can I nudge you to take a shot at that question about where you first felt you were a leader, and did it depend on any kind of career success, or were there other circumstances that caused you to recognize that part of your identity?
Sure, thank you. I think it's a good question because I think that I had a different sort of epiphany in realizing a different kind of leadership. That I was a quote-unquote leader. I mean, in college, I ran the women's rugby club, which was an unwieldy group if ever there was one, and there were certainly leadership elements there. But I guess professionally, I haven't run very large teams or managed large teams or organizations directly, but I think what did it for me was recognizing that I am a thought leader and a role model and a leader, I guess, in trying to be genuine and in exploring these issues and putting my expertise out there in a way that matters. And I think the seminal moment for me was taking a seminar with an organization called the Op-Ed Project. which is an initiative. It's a social venture aimed at broadening the range of voices in public discourse, starting with getting more women on the op-ed pages. And I read about it in the New York Times a couple of years ago and thought it was just the coolest thing and ran out and signed up for it. And it totally resonated with me and hit all the right buttons to the extent that I joined their advisory board and am now a fervent evangelist for the organization. But it is very much about owning your expertise and being able to convey why it matters to the world. And just a brief anecdotal example of how it works. You know, we all went around the room and introduced ourselves, and it was all women. And then the seminar leader said, "Okay, now do it again, and this time say, 'Hello, my name is blank, and I'm an expert in blank.'" And suddenly, all these fabulous women who had just introduced themselves and their achievements had a lot of trouble with the word expert, and so they made everybody do it, and that was really powerful for me, because we talked about, we've talked in part about the mechanics of writing an op-ed, but it was also about how do you recognize that your expertise and your knowledge and your opinions really matter to the world, and frankly that by holding them back you're doing a disservice. So that, to me, really reframed the notion of leadership, that it's not about managing a lot of people or a big budget. It's actually about who we are and why what we know matters.
That's terrific. We have another question from the audience, and it also has to do with this notion of adopting a leader identity, which is something that we actually at the present time here in the School of Management that we're working on. Are there any downsides to thinking of yourself as a leader? Does it somehow breed arrogance or blindness to certain organizational challenges or characteristics?
I'll take a go at this. I mean, it is, the arrogance question is really interesting, because I think, again, just continuing off the op-ed project, one of the problems, I think, why there are so few women thought leaders, and the op-ed pages, part of the genesis of this initiative is that the op-ed pages are less than 20% women. And the percentage is pretty similar or worse in corporate boardrooms and in government. I mean, we all know these statistics. And part of it is this fear of being thought of as arrogant. And I'm facing that now in putting myself out there in op-eds and articles, and getting attacked, and that's not pleasant. But again, I think it's having the conviction in your ideas, but also at the same time trying to, being humble and recognizing that I have blind spots, and being open about those. And that, to me, is how I am comfortable going forward as a leader. I'm not pretending. I'm trying not to pretend to be somebody that I'm not, but recognizing my blind spots and welcoming criticism and feedback, and taking it hopefully in the spirit in which it is delivered.
And just to add to what Christine said, I think, this is Don, surrounding yourself with people who are complement your strengths and recognizing your strengths and weaknesses, surrounding yourself with people who complement them, and empowering them to tell you when you're wrong. And I think, one of the first lessons I had to learn as ambassador was, in the State Department culture, people never tell the ambassador they're wrong. And I had to break that with my staff to the point, because there was plenty of times I was wrong, that they felt empowered to let me know, because that helps me avoid mistakes. And I think the humility Christine talked about is key to a good leader, being able to listen, being able to encourage dissent, and figuring out how you get your team to feel they can tell you when you're wrong, and how you surround yourself with people who really can complement your weaknesses.
Yeah, I mean, I agree fully with both Christine and Dawn on this. And I don't know if the question is arrogance, sort of on the other side of leadership, or being in a leadership position. But certainly you can be prone to believing that your judgment may be better than it really is, and then perhaps that's a type of arrogance. And I've certainly experienced that with what I might term sort of the dark side of being a believer in people. Sometimes is that you refuse to recognize that maybe the effort that's going to be put into getting the people that work with you to rise to their potential is not going to be organizationally sustainable. And so being sort of a fervent believer in this has clouded my judgment at times. And I agree with Dawn, the only way to correct for that may be to just empower others. And in my case, it was really empowering older mentors to come in on the decisions that otherwise I would have done on my own, and have learned that my judgment tends to go overboard in certain areas because of who I am and my own beliefs, and I needed to temper that with different voices. But I agree fully with both Dawn and Christine.
Well, great. I'll take a moderator initiative and talk just very briefly about this notion of surrounding yourself with people who will speak up. There's a terrific ethics curriculum that was developed initially here at the Yale School of Management by Professor Mary Gentile, and then exported along with her to Babson College, where she is now, called Giving Voice to Values. And it's an excellent approach to improving ethical behavior in the organization, and it is based precisely on the assumption that that you all articulated here so well, which is if you can get people to speak up around you, it's much more effective than simply preaching to people about what ethics are or what's good for the organization. That most of the time people already have fully formed beliefs about values, and what causes the organization to run off track is their inability to give voice to those values. So I think we're on to that, and that's the basis for our first year ethics curriculum in our leadership course.
That's great.
Effective communication is often described as a key skill set for effective leaders. Do you communicate as a leader different than you do in other capacities, at other times in your life, or when in non-leadership roles?
I don't think I do, so let me stop at that.
No, I don't think I put my leader hat on and adopt a different voice and then take it off and do something different.
You know, this is one where it depends on the type of leadership role. So for me, serving as ambassador, it was, you did have to use a different voice when you were speaking on behalf of your country, and sometimes even when you're speaking on behalf of your company, than you do internally. And in certain leadership roles, you can't always be yourself. You know, you can't be the person you are at home or at work because you're more in the public eye, and you have to reflect that in your communications, particularly as a diplomat.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Fair enough.
One key element of the leadership development program at the School of Management now is a system of providing both peer and professional coaches for each student in their second year. Could some of you share with us your own experiences with coaching, perhaps with mentoring, and any reflections you might have about how that has affected your development as leaders?
Sure, I've got a great mentor now. A couple of years ago, I was in a work situation where it was very unstructured, and I didn't have any mentor, and so I sort of looked around in my field and asked somebody who I really admired, and was pretty structured and specific about the ask. I told him why I wanted him to be my mentor, that it was partly his position in the field, but also just the way that he is, his style with people that I really admired. And so could we, you know, I proposed a quarterly talk in person if possible, on the phone if not, and a week beforehand I would send him you know, the question or the topic that was really on my mind so he could think about it. And it's worked out really nicely. And one piece of learning that I've had out of that relationship is that he started off by, he would give me advice. So he, you know, like one time I said, you know, I'd really like to hear about when people attack you, and it sort of feels personal, and how do you handle that? And he started off our session by saying, you know, you should always take the high road, don't stoop to their level. And I said, thanks. You know, I get the idea, but could you give me an example of where you've actually faced that? And he said, oh, well, sure, I was on this panel once, and this woman stood up, and she really attacked me, and it was personal, and I reacted really badly. You know, I was petty and gave it right back to her, and that just brought the whole event down, and I had to go back and apologize to her later. And I said, you know, that example was so much more helpful to me than telling me the platitude or the lesson. So I guess that's when learning is that I've tried to extract stories from him and from others too when I'm seeking advice, and not just what the punchline is.
I would certainly put a plug for mentoring as a way to help individuals develop. That was my path. I'm sure others have had you know, more direct coaching, professional or otherwise. But for me, choosing and asking mentors to work with me and accompany me on the journey has been a critical part, I think, of, you know, having been able to do a bit of the work that I've been blessed to have been doing over the years. And what's surprising is how willing people are to, you know, make the time to do that when you go out and ask. That's been a sort of refreshing thought for me. And I would also add one piece to the coaching equation, which is the power of peer coaching. We've actually, part of the work we do in the Rapid Results Institute is to help develop local leaders so they can carry the work forward after we disappear from the scene. And one of the tools we've been using increasingly is to create networks of peer coaches that are essentially leaders that are working on similar issues and in similar rhythms, and that are talking every 2 weeks about their experience, their reflections. And we find this to be a very powerful way to keep people both motivated and open to learning about both the task at hand as well as their own individual development. So that's been a terrific add-on to how we're trying to create an impact.
Super. Someone in the audience has asked if you ever felt out of your depth or questioned your ability to succeed at a task, particularly when you were a leader in that context. How have you been able to overcome self-doubts about your ability to succeed and power through that?
Can I answer that in a year when my book comes out and I've actually managed to write it?
So you're living the experience.
And I'll answer it when I figure out how to do it.
Go ahead, Don.
I was just going to say, I think if you're pushing yourself, which I think good leaders do, to take risks, and smart risks, but risks, you're always going to feel underconfident about what you're trying to do. And I think, you know, part of that is having people around you who you can, you know, as we talked about before, rely on to say, that's, you know, you're doing the right thing or you're not. If you surround yourself with smart enough people, so it's a team that's tackling those challenges, it's through the team you can get the confidence that you're taking the right direction. At least that's how I find my confidence, by making sure that I'm consulting with enough people and people whose opinions I value and respect to give me the confidence to overcome my own insecurities.
Yeah, I'd definitely agree with you, Don. I mean, one thing for me that I had was actually when my team was part of the problem. And after I left BP, I was working as an advisor to the United Nations Special Representative on Business and Human Rights, and it was a small virtual team, and there was a lot of politics in the mandate, as you might expect of a UN process. And I had a lot of trouble. I had just left a company environment, which I was very comfortable with, and was in this very unstructured environment that was really weird to me. And I think that part of powering through my own doubt of my contribution and my leadership and my expertise, part of what I've learned to do is when I'm experiencing those feelings of doubt and insecurity, to actually sit with them longer rather than try to drown them out or shove them aside, to actually recognize that in myself and to say, okay, what is this all about? And through, usually journaling, I mean, that's how I sort of process things, is to write, is to actually recognize what that doubt is all about and call it out and try to articulate it. And by doing that, often it doesn't totally go away, but at least I'm honoring it. Whereas if I try to shove it aside or drown it out or power through it, it tends to come back at really inconvenient moments. So that's something that I've really tried to develop, is the skill to sit with discomfort and explore it further.
Terrific. Well, because you all brought it up in the concept of risk, I'll go ahead with a question on risk and ask you, what has been your relationship to risk? Has taking risk characterized your leadership, or have you been more measured and deliberate in your undertakings as you've gone forward?
Yeah, I mean, for me, risk has just been a constant part of the equation, and I seem to have a pretty high tolerance for it. Certainly when it comes to things that I'm passionate about, and the work of the Rapid Results Institute certainly happens to be one of these areas, or maybe a primary area. So I'd say any rational person probably would have given up many times along the way. But I've always been sort of at the far side of taking the risk and saying, let's just see how we can make this work. There's a lot of voices around me that would have had me shut down the institute in 2009, 2010 around the financial crisis. Against all odds, I took the risk to keep it going. Actually, borrowed a bit of money to keep the payroll open, and we came roaring back in 2012, 2011, 2012. New partnerships, new business model. A lot of good things began to happen, and I think the tolerance of risk in that case was a big ally of mine. So I would say that's been at least part of what has helped me along the way. It may be different for different people.
Just to jump in a little bit, I guess my relationship with risk has been cyclical. As soon as I've taken a number of fairly big career jumps and risks in tackling different problems, and they've always been the most rewarding, but they're also tiring. I don't sleep well when stress is there, so I try and cycle through life and find times when I'm taking risk at work, and that's fairly all-consuming, and then there's times where I want to step back from that and focus on my family or other aspects of my life. So I try and balance throughout my career, when are the periods of sort of high stress, high reward, and when are the times where I'm going to be a little bit more settled, a little bit more comfortable with what I'm doing.
Terrific.
I'll try to answer this question.
Sometimes
well.
I think Leon's trying to come in.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Tom, and everyone else. I apologize for the technical glitches. I'll try to answer this question on risk, because risk is part of my business. In private equity, risk and return is part of the equation that I have to evaluate every day. But going back to the career side, I've also taken risks. Having been comfortable in investment banking world in the 90s, in early 2000s, and taking a big risk to join a hedge fund, to learn a completely different business, and then 2 years ago, taking even more risk, leaving an established firm in a comfortable position and to go and set up my own firm. So I think risk has been an integral part of my career and my life. In our daily business, risk and return is always the equation, we have to evaluate. And in our business, no risk, no return. So we have to take risks. But I think the fundamental question is, take measured risk. It is, you have to know all the facts, or at least to try to know as much as possible. Take an educated risk as opposed to take some random risk.
Terrific. Now, each of you in your backgrounds, it's pretty clear, has had to lead in circumstances that were perhaps less than favorable. In other words, maybe risk didn't work out so well from time to time, and you were faced with a crisis or a near crisis. Can you tell us what you've learned from going through those really challenging circumstances or crises? What that's taught you about leading people in those kinds of circumstances?
I'll jump in to make up the time that I lost.
Please go ahead.
And during my career, I have, as I mentioned, taken various risks at times. I took a very big risk in the year 2000 when I decided to leave New York investment banking and came back to China to start an internet company. Right at the time, the internet bubble was going to bust. And so that was a lot of risk for me, and probably too much risk, and ended up to being a mistake, because I just made that decision at the wrong time, and not knowing what I was capable to do and not knowing what the environment would be. So the internet venture failed, and at that point, I think referring back to that experience, the lessons learned, a couple of things. One is correct that mistake. Taking risk, and the risk was not a measured risk. Was risking into something in very unfamiliar territories, and also without a lot of backups. So I decided to reverse the situation. Essentially, I went back. So swallow that ego of yours and go back to what you know the best, and try to resume your path. This is what I did. I went back to New York and resumed the investment banking. And the second thing learned years later, when I decided to join D.E. Shaw, part of the reason I found out later, when they decided to hire me to start their business here in China, and this failed experience, this risk that I took, was actually the main reason why they hired me, because they saw somebody who had failed. They saw somebody who knew how to start a business, who learned the lessons. And that ended up being a huge benefit for me, deciding to take the second time around another risk, coming back to China and going to a different industry. But this time around, I was a lot more prepared and for a new venture. And that venture was, had a lot more relevance to my own capabilities.
I think the crisis that comes to mind that's most recent is the near death of my passion, the Rapid Results Institute, in 2009, as I mentioned earlier. And as I think back at that, what are the takeaways from that for me? Three takeaways come to mind. One is trusting my intuition. I mean, at the end of the day, yes, we need to be open and good listeners, but a decision needs to be made, and intuition does play a role there, and just being trustful of that, I think, is one thing I have learned to do. coming out of that and other experiences. The second is to try as much as possible to shield people from some of the anxieties associated with these types of situations. In a way, you hold the anxiety for the group rather than kind of disseminate it more widely. And maybe the corollary to that is a third takeaway, which is, as best as you can, trying to instill some confidence in the future in the people around you. You know, even if it means putting on what Don would call a public face to that, which goes back to the question of communication. Certainly in that situation, what I would say to my wife when we're talking in the evening is going to be about this situation would be very different from how I would come across to the people around me that I needed to carry through the journey. So these are the three things that come to mind in relation to that particular crisis that I think I took away.
Thank you. Noted leadership author Barbara Kellerman recently published a book called The End of Leadership that questions the way that leader development as an industry has progressed and the emphasis that people put on leadership versus simple performance metrics. Is leadership really that important? Do you find it valuable to think systematically about leadership, or do you just go forward and do it?
Let me go first on this one. I do believe leadership is absolutely important. I think leaders can influence the culture of an organization, of a community, both through their own behaviors, but also through the behaviors that they acknowledge and value and reward. And so there's certainly a big role for leaders, and I would generalize that further to leadership teams, because if leadership teams are not in alignment around behaviors and values, then there's going to be confusion in the organization. But I do agree with part of what you just mentioned in relation to the book. So the notion of focusing on the leader as the heroic figure, I think, is overplayed in a lot of the management lore and literature. I actually prefer to think of not so much only of leaders, but of leadership acts that can be practiced by anybody at any level in the organization. And these range from things. I mean, for me, the most powerful leadership act that I've seen, and this is in a team out in a community in sub-Saharan Africa, in Sudan, for example, where a team member would kind of rise to the occasion and inspire the rest of the team to keep going on the commitments that they've made. For me, that's a leadership act, even though this individual probably will never be called, a leader in an organizational sense. And I think there is hundreds of leadership acts that can be practiced every day, and that's partly what needs to be conveyed in the whole leadership literature, so that we don't just focus on leadership development as developing the individual and their attributes, but rather giving people a chance to practice on a day-to-day basis leadership acts.
Yeah, I'd just agree with everything that Nadim just said, and that thinking, I don't know if systematically is exactly the right word, but deliberately about being genuine, and that to me is what leadership is about, and that yes, that does require thought. It doesn't happen automatically, and that's actually quite the opposite. If you're on autopilot, it's not going to work.
Great. Well, with 5 minutes left, we'll turn to another question from the audience. And this person would like to hear the panelists' perspectives on how purpose influences their career choices. For example, How have you identified what is meaningful to you and gone about seeking or evaluating opportunities to live that, especially if it's involved significant shifts of direction?
Sure, I'll tackle that one first, because I think it is in part, it relates to your earlier question about risk. And then I've realized that trying to write this book, this is, for me right now, it is a huge risk. I mean, I'm not working full time, I'm writing this book, and that's a huge risk from a number of perspectives. But I think that, as we talked about earlier with risk and with, for example, with Nadim's wonderful example, I think that at some point you're taking a big risk, but at some point it doesn't feel like a risk. It feels like what you have to do to be who you are and what you want to achieve in the world. And so I also just realized I should share what my working title is, which is Girl Meets Oil, The Evolution of a Corporate Idealist. And, for me, this is very much about my purpose and sharing my story in the hopes that it will help other people be more effective in what they do. So it's very much about what I hope that my purpose and my leadership is.
Are we going to go around the horn on this one?
Well, I think I'd like to hear it from at least one more panelist.
Well, I'll go next, although I am very interested in hearing from Liang and Dawn as well. I don't know if I started with a sense of purpose that then became the driving force. Certainly the notion of creating an impact has always been there, pre-SOM, at SOM, and post-SOM. But what I recognized somewhere along the way in the corporate consulting work that I initially was doing as part of Schaefer Consulting was this tremendous pleasure and satisfaction that I would get in working with teams and organizations that then were able to see results that they did not think were possible. It's as if you're helping to take the lid off of capabilities that people had that they weren't expressing in their organizations. And to me, that experience is kind of partly what I seek in the work that I've been doing. And I've been able to translate that into the work in developing countries around social issues with the Rapid Results Institute, where the satisfaction gets even multiplied further when you see that. So that's sort of like something that I keep inspired by, and there's a bit of it's almost addictive to see that happen, to see communities that were feeling victimized begin to achieve things with very much their own resources and their own agency that they did not think were possible. For me, it's hard to beat that satisfaction you get from just watching that happen, and that's sort of been a driving force for me.
Thank you, Nadim. I'm going to give each of you a chance to answer this next question because your answers will be brief. I've asked our students at the School of Management to define leadership for them in terms of principles or tenets. And I'm going to give each of you the opportunity to give me one word, a principle, tenet, that for you best reflects leadership. Go.
Presence.
For me, it's probably integrity.
And for me, it will be performance.
For me, it's responsibility.
It's
Ladies and gentlemen,
combination of all.
Absolutely. I mean, that array of principles or tenets is, I think, very reflective of the distinguished careers that you are enjoying as graduates of the Yale School of Management. And thank you very much for your time today and for the contributions to this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists, and thank you all for joining us and for submitting your great questions. Please send any additional comments or questions to YaleSOM at som.yale.edu. A recording of this discussion will be made available at the Yale SOM alumni portal, at alumni.som.yale.edu and at Yale Insights, mba.yale.edu/insights.